Welcome, everyone. We would like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodian of this land in which Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education, so now learning environment teams are located. And we'd like to also pay respect to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend our respects to other Indigenous Australians present. This is our fifth webinar of the New Normal series. And this webinar series is really designed to creating a safe space for us to really talk about the relevance of technology and learning and teaching and engagement. And the focus of today is really looking at the deep or surface student engagement. And with this, I would like to start with these questions really for our panel to talk about. Within the curriculum, I would direct this question to Chris. Within the curriculum, what surface or deep engagement might look like? What are the implications for curriculum planning, teaching, and assessment?
Sure. Well, thank you, Xufang. I'll start us off and say I think this is really very timely with Mike Prosser and Keith Trigwell's book launch that just happened. And a lot of their research has been on surface and deep learning and how students engage. And so what I'd like to do is just share a couple slides with you that I think help us frame our understanding of how we could approach this from the point of view of a curriculum. And so I'll do that now. And if people can see those slides, should be a big old white slide saying surface versus depth. Now, I talk about this a lot in terms of assessment because that's my area of expertise, but it's broadly applicable to teaching, learning, assessment, really any kind of ways that you intend to engage with a student within the curriculum. So one way of framing this is to think about this as a taxonomic hierarchy, and the idea that there are levels stepped forward from simplicity to complexity, from surface into depth. And if we look at this diagram based on Biggs and Collis's solo taxonomy, we could see some of the ways that you could begin to choose how deep you want to go with your students in your curriculum. So if you start on the left-hand side, you can see that there's the idea of a student not having information pre-structural, but then moving into unistructural. As the name suggests, it's being able to grasp a singular idea represented here as a single line. You can identify something, you can name it, you can follow a simple procedure. But then you begin to move into the idea of being able to hold multiple pieces of information simultaneously. And I'm talking about this in terms of how the student is thinking, but we can also think about it as how is the curriculum engaging the student? Are you asking students to combine information, describe it, create serial lists, for example? These are some of the ways that you could solicit surface learning, I would argue, because those two first stages, unistructural and multistructural, are surface level. But then I would argue you cross a very important border. You begin to get into the idea that you are taking these different pieces of information and you are forming relationships with the information, one piece with another piece, analyzing, applying, comparing, contrasting, critiquing. All of these things suggest that we've now shifted into deep engagement. And finally, Biggs and Collis give us kind of a weird diagram here, which is meant to convey the idea that at the deepest level, students will actually begin producing something new. So they're not just taking pre-existing information and relating it to each other. This level of depth engagement, the curriculum is asking students to formulate something new, create a new hypothesis, reflect, which of course is the action often of taking information you've recently gained and integrating it into your whole and thinking about that whole. So all of these to me suggest ways that we can structure a curriculum around engagement. And I like this because it allows us to go beyond simply talking the abstract about surface and depth and actually begin to concretize some of the curriculum structures that allow us to vary that depth of engagement and really hit the sweet spots that we want in the curriculum.
This is fantastic. I really like the clear structures and framework. And even as somebody who has been teaching for many years, I still really helpful to really get guide and understand which level, what language are we pitching when we engage with the students. So we are not going to get frustrated students in one or the others, but really articulate it well. Any panel members would like to reflect on that?
I like the not only the idea of it being a taxonomy, but also of it being a continuum of different approaches as well. And when we map that against pedagogy, the idea perhaps of the pedagogy, andragogy, heutagogy continuum, where you start with, very teacher-centric, teacher-delivered content, and then the goal is to move towards, much more student-centric, student-determined learning, and the idea that you can slip backwards and forwards along that continuum, depending on where the students are at, and whether this is a new concept, a new idea, and you need to scaffold it to bring it to that higher level. But hopefully the goal is to move towards those higher levels along that continuum.
Yeah.
I like how it makes engagement more concrete. I like to talk engagement. Let's have student engagement. It's such a vague term, but unless you have something like this to tie it to be able to say, look, this is how we can see whether we are getting engagement or not, and we're moving beyond the surface to the deep, then you're kind of like, you're just guessing whether you're getting engagement. So the ability to have a framework to try and pin engagement to and build engagement to your curriculum is fantastic.
Yeah.
I think that also then leads into being able to measure engagement as well, doesn't it? Because that's the hard thing to do. How do you measure it?
Right. And so the language that you see there, you could see constructing outcomes, but I would argue that you could also see constructing criteria as part of a rubric, so that as you can consider what kind of assessment task design you want, you can begin by thinking, well, what is it that I'm actually going to determine? Am I going to determine quality of hypotheses? Well, from that, you would then develop deep level language around the criteria, wouldn't you?
My question is that what do you do when we have students of diverse background in one class, where we may not be able to just pitch that level in that clear-cut manner?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And yeah, Tom suggests actually in the chat, maybe that's a question for our listeners. So why don't we throw that open? In case Elise or Kate want to talk. Hey, there she is.
Sorry. I've missed half the conversation because I had to get lunch. Can you repeat the question?
Sure.
My question is, what do you do with a classroom that's very diverse? We have students of different level of understanding in one class. I actually remember, Chris, that sorry to throw it back to you, you mentioned of these beautiful case studies in Singapore.
Oh, yes. I was in Singapore, and I didn't prepare a slide for this, which is fine because, Lord knows it's the end of the semester. I think we're all sick to death of PowerPoints. So basically, I was running a subject for a postgraduate diploma program. So these were professional teachers and educational leaders. And I had designed the subject, and I was really unhappy with the student feedback that I was getting. And they were saying it's too much reading, it's too much assessment, it's too much work, it's too much of everything. And so I tried reducing the workload for them, but I got exactly the same comments. And so then I stepped back and I thought, what if this isn't really a workload issue? What if it's an engagement and buy-in issue? And what I did was I started allowing the students in the next semester from day one, partnership opportunities in designing aspects of their engagement. And so, for example, I designed most of the rubrics, but I left a few little gap areas where they could design criteria and levels of criteria that they were evaluated on. I created curated collections of the readings, but then asked the students to then create a pattern of reading that they thought was most applicable to their professional objectives. And I also asked them what kind of assessments they wanted to do. I gave them options. I didn't just leave it open-ended. But it was amazing the transformative change that that had on the experience that the students reported, but also on my experience. At the end of the semester, not a single student had complained about the amount of reading, about the assessment. In fact, as I recall, they gave themselves more reading and more assessment than I ever had from the first start. And they were enthusiastic about doing it. They did the readings. They turned in the assessment on time and really gave it their all. And you know, this is worth considering too. I got the best student evaluations that I have ever gotten in a subject. And it's not bad either when we talk about doing this kind of stuff, that we see that we get some blowback benefit as well, not just our students.
Yeah, I really love that example, Chris. And I think, you know, it highlights another lens to put over engagement, and sort of raises for me the questions of the way that Dewey describes occupations. So this idea of ontological education. So what you've created there is a scenario where your diverse student cohort have had that level of agency to engage as individuals with something that they're really interested in, which is sort of one of the two criteria that Dewey puts forward for what is an occupation. So maybe you could develop that a little bit more for us. Like, is this like a potential secret that we could use in our arsenal to help develop more of that sort of emotional and really deeply self-interested engagement?
Well, yeah. And I think if you want to do that, my recommendation would be looking at the Students as Partners Network. And this is a big movement. It's international, but UQ is the epicenter of the Students as Partners movement. And so they've got all sorts of fantastic resources. And I'll put a link in the chat box in just a moment or two after I get done. But I think really what we are talking about is developing equitable and meaningful partnerships with our students, and ones that appreciate and account for the diversity of learners that Xiu Fang brought up. You know, there's nothing keeping you from allowing students some space to make these assignments and these subjects their own in ways that still don't overburden you as the lecturer. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's part of the key, Chris, is that thinking beyond ourselves as the, you know, the fount of all knowledge and where the learning design has to come from to our students. And one way to, you know, strategies to bring in that level of engagement is through negotiation, where the students negotiate their learning outcomes and learning strategies and assessments, etc. But also through perhaps their curating their own work, and that's where perhaps e-portfolios can come in. And I know Brian does a lot of work around that. And you know, then how does that map to, as Brian was talking about it before, about ontological pedagogies, about pedagogies that are about the change as you're moving from being a student to becoming a professional in the field. And that's what the education is about, is we want students to actually transform from being a learner, well, you know, I suppose, to being an active participant in a particular.
Well, that's progression too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you mentioned earlier, Tom, about the idea of, for example, using Biggs and Collis's solo taxonomy as a progression from surface to depth. Well, at the same time, our larger consideration is the progression of the student from a scaffolded experience to one that is highly self-regulated. Yeah.
I loved what you said about this transformation that happened to the students as well as to yourself as well. So we learn a lot. We are not just the teachers, the expert of the field, but we also become a learner. I think that the magic of that is the flip of a relationship, that the student being empowered and we actually share power. And then they have more agency and ownership of the material, and then the engagement become more trusting and collaborative and equitable. That is fascinating. Do you think that with that highest level of engagement, I would really see that we can still apply the framework of using the same idea of different level of, you know, deep and surface engagement framework to analyze and assess, to evaluate student engagement, or we have to change that as well?
Well, I think we absolutely can. In fact, I would argue that it's a must, because if we value engagement and we see a target as being one that moves forward, then we have to be able to find ways that we determine if the engagement is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And I would argue it's not just an assessment issue, is it? It's an evaluation issue for our programs, for our teaching, for how we engage. You know, we have to be able to determine whether or not we're meeting our objectives.
And I think you can, once again, you can scaffold that as well. So perhaps at the lower end of the continuum, you give students a limited range of choices. You know, choose from these 3 options or 4 options or whatever. So there is still some choice and negotiation, but it's within a limited bounded area that you've kind of defined as the expert. And then as you move up the continuum, students are you know, feel a bit more safer with being open, then you can make it much more open and allow them to come up with the topics.
Yeah. You gave me new ideas now, Tom. I'm thinking about the scaffolding is that some of the students in the class, they may have different level of understanding and engagement. Those who are already at the deep level of understanding could take on more of the leadership role almost, and then have that peer mentoring to guide the others together. And again, peer-to-peer level of engagement. They take the teachers out and you know, they kind of learn together and learn from each other's. And
that's also one way to make it scalable, Sufang. You know, if you've got large number, how do you do it with large numbers? That's always the question. That's fine in the small group, but you know, I've got 100 students. How do I you know, move towards student directed learning in a large group? Well, that's where the peer interaction comes in. You know.
I was gonna bring Kat in on that point, because yeah, I think that's what we're describing sounds wonderful and amazing, but yeah, how does it scale is always the big question, Kat.
Want me to answer that?
Yeah.
For the university? Oh dear, how does it scale? I mean, I think Tom's point about you can use the peer review tools and the peer and group work very effectively, but you know, good group work and good peer evaluation or peer work takes really good learning designing, really good thoughtful thinking about how to set up that activity. So, and that might not necessarily be a skill the subject coordinator has. So there's support is needed really to help people redesign their curriculum or their subjects or their activities at whatever level you want to go to make to have engagement and student engagement as a priority in what we're getting them to do. Yeah,
I think that's a really good point, Kat. It's like, don't just think this is all on you as the one teacher in a course. You know, gather a group of people around you and collaborate on this learning design. You know, create a team around it.
Collaborative effort. Yeah, that leads to the next questions. That is actually, Catherine, you will be a perfect answer that. What changes do you think could happen at a university service level to enhance students' engagement? So we are actually in a huge institution that have hundreds of years of traditions of how do we teach, how do we lectures, and we kind of build it up with these structures, including technology that come with that structure and system.
yes.
That can be hard to change. So what change would need to happen to allow that sort of collaborative, flipped classroom, participatory kind of learning to enhance student engagement?
Yeah, and I'll answer this assuming that I've got no limits on my budget. Or even structural limits within the University of Melbourne or any big university or small. But I mean, one of the first things you'd have to think of is what that evaluation question that I think Brian already hinted at, or was it Chris? That, you know, currently we evaluate teaching and learning performance through SES. You know, and we know the problems of our subject experience survey. We know the problems that this has. You know, women don't do well as men in this surveys. People who aren't white don't do as well. So it's not actually a good measure of teaching and learning. If we would have to really think about how we were going to measure performance of teaching and learning and engagement in teaching and learning, which would come down to, like, how are we going to academically promote our teaching staff as well. You know, how do we measure them being successful, which might move entirely away from SES and looking at completely different measures. Maybe they have to put forward a portfolio of work to demonstrate how they've perhaps worked collaboratively to consider engagement as a priority in their subject. That's a huge turnaround. So fundamentally, we have to support academics being brave and moving away from what they know, and because everything we've talked about, you know, partnering with students, that's a huge step for an academic. They're not going to go, oh yeah, I'm going to go do that necessarily, unless they're really supported, encouraged and promoted to do it, and there's supports around them. Maybe we need, like University of Queensland has a whole group that just supports engagement and changing curriculum and teaching practices and student supports around engagement. And we would need it to be aligned across all our units. You know, in the case of University of Melbourne, it would be student IT, it would be our library staff, it would be MCSHE, it would be learning environments, it would be the teaching staff and how promotions concerned done. So if I was going to invent the universe, I would put student engagement as a priority, and help change our institutions from the traditional ways we've come from to support them to be brave and move into this world.
Wonderful.
And I think that comes down to also the institution being brave with its infrastructure as well, and being a bit more open to what is the appropriate tool to use, rather than, you know, just the 4 institutionally supported tools. You know, being much more authentic in the infrastructure behind supporting authentic learning and engagement. Yeah.
I would like to invite our audience to join in as well. So it's not just we sharing. I think it would be really good that we take this as a flight. And if Elisa and Kate, would you like to contribute?
Sure. I think there's Kat's raised a pretty big elephant in the room, which is not just about promotion structures, but also about if you're making any kind of change to your curriculum, especially if it's a little bit new and you're learning how to deliver that confidently, generally there's going to be a dip in student satisfaction ratings because of that in the short term. And that's a really, you know, and for someone who's risk averse or who is, you know, if that leads into your promotions, then there's potentially an incentive not to change. And so, you know, and that's where I think Kat was kind of raising that, like, all of the university structures that support staff kind of need to be working in tandem to help give people the space to, you know, like potentially fail, you know, like just to be able to take risks and try new things, because that's kind of just part of the learning process. And I think there's also a piece around, I guess, in my role as a learning designer, around providing safe spaces for people to make change as well. I'm doing a heap of reading around transformative learning theory at the moment. And so thinking about how do we build psychologically safe spaces for people and support them in feeling like they can make those kind of shifts in their habits of mind, or in their, you know, in what they've kind of had as previously held assumptions. And how do we do that? Because it's not just about students going on a journey. If you're changing your practice, you know, as a teaching staff or academic staff member, you're also having to go on quite a big journey of change, and that can be quite scary.
I think that's good points, Kate, though, around providing a safe and supportive environment for people who are wanting to really, you know, do something different in their teaching, and just to feel supported when perhaps something doesn't go quite right, because that's when you learn from your mistakes, don't you? If something works perfectly, then you haven't really learned too much. But you try something and it didn't work, well, then you go, okay, I learned from that, I'm going to do this differently next time. But they need support in doing that in partnerships.
And the other elephant in the room behind that is really academic workload. And that would take, really re-looking at that and the priorities around that would take a huge institutional restructure.
Yeah, I agree with all those points. The incentive to try new things isn't there as long as we have really high workloads and precarious employment conditions and the lack of institutional support for people who want to experiment. I think things may be changing a little bit. I think some small grants can offer some incentive for teaching relief, or for get an RA in or something like that, and that can help. And I guess it's up to us to provide that support at the point at which we can, but then also encourage people to talk with colleagues and build those communities of practice as well, and that can be quite good as well. You don't want to be the sole instructor doing something different, and then in a sea of didactic lecturers, you don't want to be the only person doing something different, because that won't be something that the students are used to. And if your employment is dependent on good SES scores, then the incentive isn't there. I totally agree with what everyone's saying.
Although I've had staff who kind of relish being a bit of a
that's good.
And then sometimes that can get them into trouble with other teaching staff, because they get students saying, "Why do you do this? And you're doing all this amazing stuff. And then why are all my other teachers doing this other thing?" And so it can.
That's true. The other side of the coin, it can work the other way, which is great.
Yeah, but it really is a point well taken that you have to be comfortable with that position, because you're going to be in that position potentially if you're the odd person out. And I was partnering with somebody who's in one of the faculties at University of Melbourne, and she found herself in that position. She was not comfortable in that position. And a lot of what she had to work with was getting students past certain tacit assumptions about how they should be engaged with. And many of these assumptions were learned assumptions from their first year within the program she taught in. And once they got on board, they were like, oh yeah, we totally understand, and this makes good sense. But there was definitely this hump that she had to get over of preconceptions.
And I think that's a key point, Chris, is that if you're wanting to really bring about significant change and engagement in a whole program, you've got to start in first year and build the basis, the foundation, and the student expectations, so that, you know, as you move up into second year and third year, it's not the sudden hump or jump in pedagogical approaches, but it's the foundation is laid in first year, and students, you know, learn to expect that as they move through.
There's also those kind of issues around student assumptions around learning in terms of what they want versus what actually might best support their learning, and the two aren't necessarily don't necessarily marry up, particularly around active learning. It takes longer. Students don't necessarily it tends to lead to better learning gains, but students don't necessarily perceive it as such, and so there's a little bit of a disconnect there that can be quite difficult to then overcome, and that's where I guess that the point around evaluation is really potentially important, in that if you can show how students have met the learning outcomes and met the assessments and see that kind of data improve, and then feed that back to students, maybe that's a way to bridge that gap a little bit more.
I agree. And I think, Kate, your point is so important, that we need to make the case to students. And there's all sorts of things around which, like active learning, as you said, but peer feedback. We know from the empirical research that by and large, peers don't want to give feedback, and they don't want to get feedback, because frankly, they don't think that they're qualified or that their peers are qualified. When in fact, we know that peer feedback does have very salutary outcomes for student learning. So I think there are all sorts of different examples where what we have to do is actually show students and say, look, this is what you're going to get out of this, or at least this is what the intention is that you're going to get out of this. I'm not just doing this randomly. And that's super important.
That's why we've got to do that structural. If we really think student engagement is important, it's got to be structured into the whole curriculum for the whole course, you know, from the start. And the e-portfolio example is classic for this. You need to start in first year, you need to teach them how to do it. And, you know, it's a great assessment piece, because it's, if you go back to that solo taxonomy, it's right there at the end, because they're creating their own portfolio of evidence of learning. But unless you have it structured through the whole course, it's really thought of as a priority through the course, you're just doing it piecemeal. It doesn't really work.
Just wanted to throw something else in there that's possibly controversial, but just like the idea of if I'm scratching my head and thinking, okay, I want to make my teaching more engaging, just making it feel a bit more acceptable to potentially pick up an archetype, or I don't want to use the word template because people get very upset when you say that, but if there are some recipes that people could follow and they feel a bit more comfortable when they're first starting out, to be able to be supported in trying out a different way. So, you know, maybe there is an archetype for ontological education, or there's one that's more around like a community of inquiry, just to be able to pick those up and have a bit more guidance and scaffolding for the teacher themselves to be able to try a new way of doing things might help encourage people.
I think also, as you know, Chris was saying, just making why you're doing things from a teaching learning perspective explicit to students, not assuming that they're going to make the connection as to why are we doing group work, why are we doing e-portfolios that we've never done before. You have to tell them why, because they're not the teaching and learning expert.
No, and we know from analyzing patterns across 3- and 4-year undergraduate programs that students become more discriminating in their own education, so that by year 3, maybe you don't have to make such a big case. But year 1, and of course that is the prime year where you have to start getting people to buy in. Yeah, you've got to make that case, because looking at the patterns of student evaluation, they are not discriminating connoisseurs of their own educational experience. You have to help them develop that palette.
I think another strategy is to look to our alumni as well and say, here's a recent graduate, they've got a job in the profession or domain, whatever, and they come back and they reflect on their learning to the first year or second year students and say, this is what worked for me. And, you know, thinking back, it was hard, but hey, this is what was needed, and sort of making that case back down, you know, to the first year students.
It ties back into your points about andragogy as well, in that, you know, if we're talking about adult learners, which I mean we all are as well in some respects, like, you know, like I only want, you know, as an adult learner, that, you know, the theory is that you're motivated by something that you can directly use and that is directly relevant to your, you know, what you're going to be applying. And so in which case, you know, if I can't see how this is going to benefit me or how I can apply it into my mental models or apply it in my work or, you know, use it in some way, then why am I going to bother learning it and taking that effort in?
Yeah, I actually had some experience doing that. Different program, same institution, National Institution of Education, where I was running a master's program, and it was a tough sell because it was a co-branded master's between Columbia University's Teachers College and NIE, which meant it was a little bit more expensive. And students were like, well, but why? And the answer to that, we could have talked till we were blue in the face, but instead we pulled in some alumni. And these were people who were very well-placed school leaders, and it was a program in school leadership. And they had the jobs that our graduates really, really wanted. And so these folks came in and everyone paid attention. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what they said. They said, look, these, you may not see it right now, but here's why you need these skills. And here's why you actually need this program as opposed to perhaps another program. And boy, it was like a completely different response than if we had attempted the sale, you know?
Well, many of us already touched on the staff actually need to be part of this change. So now partly we need students to understand the purpose of learning. The staff also need to rethink the purpose of teaching. So the questions for our new normal series now is that what sort of PDs, what sort of professional development training do you think academic and professional staff would need to improve their capabilities in student engagement? Reflecting on what we have discussed so far, Chris, you share with us the framework of deep and surface learning of student engagement, and you share with us the brilliant example in Singapore, and how you flip the model and how to transform the experience. And can you also talk about the change need to happen at the service level and the university level? What sort of PDs would look like? I have 4 propositions. Do you mind if I actually start with that? And then we kind of build on that. So this 4 is really looking at the what, the why, and the how, and how do we go about it. The first, what is student engagement? We need, in these PDs, we need to even unpack this notion of what student engagement means. We need to deconstruct and reconstruct the purpose and the concepts of student engagement. And building on our earlier conversations, what does that look like in the context of new normal? And we need to know that the student engagement will be different next year than from the past. And more students will be studying online, and more students will want more sense of agency and ownership in their learning. So that's the what aspect of what is student engagement. What does that look like? The second proposition is the why does it matter? Why do we need to ask those questions? So in the PD, we need to ask the why questions. That is really asking the intentions and the purpose. We need to demystify and debunk some of the myth of student experience and student engagement that we have already experienced in one of our first episodes. By reinstating the real purpose of engagement, it's about human relationship. It's about reciprocity, about mutuality, about respect, about being together in the long term. Then we look at engagement differently. They are not just here for a short stay. And then we are this learning experience. The student remember this experience 50 years later, that was the best class they have experienced. And in doing so, we draw on the idea of a university as an ecosystem where student, staff, community, alumni are interconnected and interdependent units. And then we need everyone to thrive in this environment, in this ecosystem, because in that way, we are all healthy together, we can learn together, and we all benefit together. So that really flipped that notion. So the PD is just a one-off silos of you do this, and then you'll be able to teach and you'll be able to engage. So that why question really encompassing in a way of holistic understanding of what student engagement could look like. And then real linking to Brian's notions of the ontological understanding of engagement. And the third proposition is about how are we going about engaging with staff members to think this way. We talk about workload, and we talk about staff may feel insecure and unsafe. So what sort of tools and pedagogies we need to engage with staff so that they can engage better? And then we really like, Chris, your earlier conversation about co-design. Can we engage with our staff, our colleague, and co-design the type of PDs so we can learn together, that create a community of practice that needed, that bring academic and professional staff as one so that we are not separate into delivering that the kind of PD that is critical, is participatory, that's reflective and transformative. So I'll end here. Let's opening up to everybody to unpack and discuss. Is it too idealistic? It's impossible. Blue sky thinking.
No, I think you're right, Sufeng. I think our professional development approaches should model what we're, asking of our students, the same types of pedagogy. If we're looking at collaboration, if we're looking at teamwork, if we're looking at, critical thinking, etc., those got to be the basis of our professional development as well, not just something that's quick and easy to tick off. So I'm just kind of reflecting also from, my own experience of teaching a paper this year for the GCAT and just perhaps some of the student feedback, and all my students were teaching staff. And interesting comment from one of them was that he joined the course because he wanted to learn how to use Canvas, and that's what he thought the course was about, how to, tips for how to use Canvas, and then found out, well, person that was going to teach him how to learn Canvas was himself, because that wasn't what the course was about at all. It was about creating community inquiry around the issues and the theory and of online learning. So that was really interesting feedback to get from him, actually.
Yeah, I really like that. That goes to the point that I was actually going to make, Thomas, which is I think professional development that enables teachers to experience the experience of what it is that we want them to then share and teach with our students is really powerful. Like I had a lot of great experiences when I was doing my graduate certificate in tertiary teaching, where you could actually see the good teaching practices modeled to you. You could feel yourself becoming engaged in it. And that then gives you that level of motivation to share those experiences then with your students. And it definitely stays with you. And going back to the question about what is deep learning, when you really have those kind of engaging experiences, you don't forget them.
Yeah, deep learning is transformative, isn't it? And when you look at some of the frameworks that have been modeled off of surface versus depth, like the SAMR model, which talks about how we use technology, it's a 4-part model, just like the solo taxonomy model. And the last 2 parts are about technology as a transformative engagement. And I don't think that's coincidence. I think it absolutely is the same thing. When you get deep, you are transforming something and it's meaningful. But, you know, to connect that to Tom's point too, if we do want to embody what we are suggesting within our actual professional development, yeah, there are times where
I wonder what Chris was going to say. So,
That was about to be a deep and meaningful moment.
He's just paused to consider what he's going to say next.
Yeah, he's looking very considering at the moment. Yeah. I was wondering if it's just my connection, but it seems to be everyone's.
Yeah, the technology is not transforming in this instance.
He'll be back with us momentarily.
Yeah, I mean, we've all transformed to fully online, and we've gone to emergency fully online, which we're calling it. Well, not we have, but the university has, the teaching staff. But you know, how many of our teaching staff have actually ever learnt online and know what good online learning is? I would argue very few, and yet we're asking them to develop these online subjects. It's almost madness that they haven't experienced it, yet they're having to design it. Chris, we lost you, but you were saying something great.
Sorry about that. I was bloviating, and I think my computer got sick of hearing me. So I'll say it very quickly. Yeah, look, there are times where we have to do what the institution wants when it comes to professional development. But if that comes without paying attention to what the people who are in the classroom actually need, PD doesn't work. You know, it's like water off a duck's back. You have to listen to the people who are there in the classrooms. What do they need? What do they want? And be responsive.
Any others would like to reflect on the PDs for the university style to engage better?
I think the hard part is that like teaching staff are just busy and overworked, and then, you know, so it's about designing something that's going to meet people's needs, but also fit into their, you know, like meet people at where they're at and fit into their, you know, their workload, and be something that is kind of sustainable, both from their end and from, I guess, the people who are, you know, from our end, if we're the ones designing and delivering that. So and that's where I think like some of Tom's work, like I've been following the CMOOC, and I think those sorts of like communities of practice where maybe you're kind of drip feeding pieces to show, well, look, you know, it's a little bit less formal, you know, here's something small that you can do. You can do it in X amount of time. You've got the week, and then you're kind of presenting it back can be quite useful in that it's not sort of trying to do everything at once, you know, and it can be manageable for people within their workload. So I'm really interested in those sorts of things and building, you know, communities of practice, because people want to see what other people who look like them are doing as well. So, you know, it's one thing for me to say, oh, well, look, I think you could do X, but, you know, I'm not a teaching staff member in the same discipline as you. And so I think being able to see what other people who are doing similar things, you know, in context, you know, always helps as well.
I actually like to build on, Chris, your earlier example, when you were already very busy and then you were trying to meet students' expectations and get frustrated when you already make changes of reading load and assessment tasks in Singapore context, and then students still not satisfied. I like that idea of the light bulb moment. When you actually had that light bulb moment, everything changed. So the type of PDs that I really give people that light bulb moment is actually save academic lots of time later, that we actually not banging our head in the wall. That's really trying to fix a problem that we couldn't really quite fix. So yeah, I like the community of practice. I think creating safe space to share ideas and stories and practices could be a useful one.
That reminds me, Xu Fang, it's like the threshold concepts in learning for students. So there will be threshold concepts for teachers as well, and moments where things click. And I think modelling is very important. You mentioned modelling before, Brian, of good practice, but I think modelling of support as well at the disciplinary level from departmental and faculty leaders, ADEs, sorry, Associate Deans of Teaching and Learning, and those sorts of people. I think that sort of thing is very important because, as you mentioned, Kate, a lot of the learning comes from within your own discipline. And if the learning, and that, if that's at the institutional level, within your teaching team, but also you've got that support from your faculty or department, and you have maybe an external support as well, these online supports, which we all have as well. I think that together all needs to work, and it's a system. It's a complex system of supports that need to happen rather than individual sessions.
I think
we heard from Mike too yesterday about Mike Prosser yesterday about sorry Kat, about how the it's a process of transition for the teacher and not something that can be done in individual sessions. So if that's supported by your leadership team, then I think that is part of the puzzle. Yes, apologies, I'll mute now.
No, I think I was going to say exactly the same thing, Alyssa. You know, we know that programs work rather than an individual come to an hour and a half and see something. It's that changes practice. But and doing it locally is ideal, like within the discipline. But you've also got to be mindful that disciplines have set ways too, so you've got to get them to break that too. So you've got to have enough disruption in that group to make sure that they aren't just going to what they know already and repeating that they actually are transforming their teaching and learning.
I think, yeah, that's a good point, Kat, is the idea of signature pedagogies can often be a little box that people, you know, a little safe box that people stay within. Whereas when you get people together from different contexts, they can learn from different discipline contexts and hopefully go beyond that little box that they put themselves in. But I think one of the key elements that needs to be built into professional development is time for reflection. And you know, as you said, Kate, then you've got to build time into your professional development activities. They can't be just a one-off 1 hour. You know, that can be a starting point, but you've got to go beyond that to allow those sort of critical reflection and eureka moments. Yeah,
and the other thing that I think, or at least that I've found in the work that I do, is that concrete examples are really useful and really important. I guess one thing for me to say, well, look, I think it would be useful if we applied this theory or you take on this activity, but immediately the question is, can I see an example of what that looks like almost every time. And so, and I mean, that's work, obviously, for me, in that, like, I have to build up a bank of examples, and ideally ones that aren't just me kind of doing dummy, you know, texting something, because that's not really a great example. So that's like difficult getting enough examples, but I think that's really important. And so, you know, where it's across disciplines or taking other approaches, the more we can kind of build reference points for people so that they can see how things work in practice, that's really valuable.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you have professional development that doesn't necessarily give you something you can take away and apply, and a clear example to follow, it can sometimes just kind of get lost. So having that clear example there, Kate, I think is a really good point. I can pick something up and try this in my teaching very, very soon today. And if I can then bring that back and discuss it with my peers, then I'm probably going to even have a deeper learning experience following on from that. So some of the study I did in my graduate certificate was very applied in that nature. So the assessment tasks were really about design something that you can use in your teaching practice and then bring it back and discuss it with the group and have a sort of a critical discussion about how it went and why it was and wasn't effective.
And I think that point's really important, Brian, because the best PD I've ever designed is when the people in that program have had to demonstrate that they have changed something. And they're accountable to change. They're not just coming along to hear a nice idea, think, oh, that'll be good, flipped classroom, that would be nice to do. I'll think about that. They actually are there, and then they've got to apply it and reflect on it. And that is where PD is effective.
What I hear so far, that the PD need to be engaging. The PD can include some sort of framework, like what Chris framework, like the deep end and then the surface, and it really give people a bit of a structure to understand what engagement could look like. But also PD need to be applied and with real example, and people can go away, try it out, have time to reflect, and transformation could happen. So that's a really wonderful way to, I think, take us to episode 5 of the New Normal webinar series. I really want to take this opportunity to thank all of us together, all of you, all of us together in this conversation. I find it nourishing, empowering, and encouraging. And well done, all of us. 2020 has been a difficult, challenging, turbulent year with a lot of things happen to require changes. In thinking of next year, hopefully this idea of the new normal or COVID normal, this conversation helped us to plant some seeds to really help them think about what sort of student learning, teaching, and engagement could look like. And I wish all of us a wonderful break. And thank you all for sharing.